Hello everyone, I'm very pleased to welcome back Samantha Baldwin to continue explaining her story and her family story, which involves horrific child abuse and also horrendous decisions by the state, which has handed children over to the abuser. Before we had got to early 2015 in the chronology of events. So Samantha, I'd ask you to maybe just recap briefly what was the situation in early 2015 and then continue from there.
Sure. So early 2015, the boys had just disclosed they'd spent the entire month of December disclosing, and that's the first I knew about it. Prior to that, I didn't know. I was concerned, very, very concerned about the behaviour, but I didn't know what it was down to. So they disclosed, and it was pretty clear by the beginning of 2015 that this wasn't just sexual abuse, that it was satanic ritual abuse, which I'd never even heard about at that point. And it was clear that it was a large paedophile ring as well. And it was also intergenerational. My ex's parents had been named. Again, you wouldn't think in a million years that these people be involved in such hideousness with their own grandchildren, because what they presented to the outside world was very, very different to what my sons described. So I just wanted to make that clear to people. You can't tell what these people look like at all, or by the behaviour. So anyway, obviously we went to the police, which was GMP. It was clear from the onset that the first investigating officer was taken in by the father. So the next officer who interviewed the boys, she was better and she believed the boys. But there was still involvement from the original police officer that we complained about, and his boss, who'd actually shouted down the phone to a family member of mine, calling her a fantasist and saying that the disclosures were ridiculous and fantasy, because there were lots of men involved and injections. And that was Rochdale Police. And that very year, they said lessons have been learned about the grooming gangs whereby children were ignored, about many men and being drugged. So this is just horrific. This
is incredible. This is in Rochdale.
Yeah.
Of all police forces in the United Kingdom. If anyone should have learned the lesson, it's Rochdale. It's astonishing.
Exactly. It was absolutely. It was like from then on, after the complaint about the DC, it was like they were on a mission to destroy my family, basically. So anyway, so as I say, the disclosures became worse. They kind of stopped after a while in January, after the boys' second ABE interviews. Oh, well, it was my youngest ones only, and it was my eldest second at the end of January. And then there was just some more disclosures in April, which involved yet more people and more descriptions of SRA. And two of the people actually lived in the village that we just moved to, so we just thought, we can't stay here. I'm very close to my mum and sister, and they've been incredibly supportive. So we all moved down to Newark together, because that's where my sister's partner lived. He lived there at the time, so she moved in with him. So
just before you leave the area, the total police response initially, how they arrested your husband.
Yeah, so the police response was that they arrested my ex-husband. He was released after a few hours on police bail terms. A few weeks later, there were two more arrests of these two men who were married to each other. And then there was also cautions of the grandparents in Devon. They were cautioned at their house. And then there was two more interviews of my sons at the end of January. And that was it. You know, bearing in mind the hair had been taken at that point by once my eldest son disclosed injections on the 22nd of December. After a few more disclosures, I began to wonder if he'd been drugged. So when they went for their checks at the beginning of January, the hair samples were taken. Then they were sent to police forensics, and then it was my understanding at that point that the police would test the hair, but they didn't. And I didn't persist at that point because I was traumatized and And at that point, I didn't actually see how much detail my eldest son had gone into in his second AB interview, which I only found out the year later. So that was the entirety of the police response at that point.
Okay.
And
the second interview from your eldest son, what sort of detail, without going to huge specifics, but what sort of detail was he revealing? Just so we can get an idea of the sort of evidence that the police had.
Yeah.
From the children.
Yeah, exactly. Well, from my eldest son, who was 7.5 at the time, he went into great description about the injections, about who did it, which was Daddy. He was cross-examined many times, and he kept, who did it, Daddy. He slumped down on the sofa to demonstrate the effect that it had on him. He said that it was a very, very, very fine needle, and he said it felt like a mosquito bite. So he gave a lot of, and then he also said that his father and his father's housemate would go up in the loft together for the injections. And he said they'd be whispering, and he said he thought he saw like the shadow of, them getting the injections and the equipment, the drugs, etc. out of the loft. All of that was ignored. They didn't even search his house.
This isn't, it's a story we've heard over and over again, but yeah, they didn't search the house. So there's clear evidence.
Yes.
There's clear reason to believe that more evidence is available.
Absolutely.
And the police just don't react.
Absolutely. If they'd have, at that point he would have moved anything, because that was the second AB interview. He'd already been arrested. But if they'd have searched his house at the first disclosure, they would have found that, but they didn't. They just asked him to hand over a phone and a laptop. Mm-hmm. And I know he's got another laptop, but he didn't hand that in. I just want to contrast that to one of my arrests, because as you can imagine, I've been arrested 3 times since all of this. The last arrest was last year in April, and I was arrested for suspicion only over somebody who had been taking pictures of my ex-husband outside his house. And I was arrested with no evidence of a suspicion only of me colluding with this person, who has since been let off, by the way, who was found not guilty of this alleged harassment and stalking. So they arrested me on suspicion only, because when I got to the police station, I said, can you show me your evidence? Oh, we haven't got any, it's just a suspicion. They went through my house, they went in plants, they went behind pictures, they went in the loft. They took every bit of paperwork I had. They took all my devices, my laptops, iPads, phones, and I've only just got them back a couple of months ago, and they kept them for a year, and it was like nothing, basically. So why can't they do that for an alleged paedophile?
It's a stunning comparison.
Yeah.
Yes, it really is.
Yeah. So yeah, at that point, that was the police investigation. It was just nothing, basically.
So you decided, again, this is something we see all the time, you decide that for safety, that you have to move to a different part of the country.
Yes.
Okay, so you pick it up from there, yeah.
Yeah, so we moved to Newark in Nottinghamshire, and we moved on in July 2015. Bearing in mind, I just got my own house out of the settlement, so that was sat there empty. My mum left her house empty. My sister was just renting, so she went and moved in with her partner. My mum left her business. She was doing really well. She'd left her business to come down and support us. So we just basically, we started a new life there, and the boys just blossomed. They were much happier, much more relaxed. They started to learn, my eldest son, who previously really struggled with learning, he was learning. It was amazing. He was being homeschooled because he was still too traumatized to leave me to go to school. I got my youngest one in school, luckily, and that was going well. And I got my eldest son involved in all kinds of homemade community activities and stuff to meet up with lots of other people. And then I got a phone call in end of September 2015 from the police saying no further action. We sent it to the CPS, not enough evidence, blah blah blah. So I wasn't surprised, as you can imagine. So literally a few weeks after, what did I get through the post? Family court papers for Family Court Nottingham, citing emotional harm and applying for shared custody by him.
Yes. So this is also the pattern we see, that anyone who reports abuse, it comes before the authorities, and it's viewed as it's viewed as emotional harm. It's viewed as some sort of manipulation. It's viewed as being toxic, and it's criminalized. So the fact of reporting horrendous abuse to the authorities is itself almost immediately criminalized.
Yeah.
I've spoken to a charity in Dundee called Izzy's Promise, and they found this was so common that and they deal with satanic ritual abuse, Satanist ritual abuse, and they were dealing with women fleeing horrendously abusive situations, and often they had children. And they were seeing time and time again that when they went to the authorities, the first thing that would happen is social services would come in and take the children off the women, because, well, you know, you're making all these wild accusations, so we're worried about your mental health, we're taking the kids. And the second thing that would happen is the children were handed over to the abuser. And they saw this over and over and over again, and it got to the point that they would say to the women, is there somewhere you can run to, someone you can trust? He said, right, take the kids, don't tell anyone, don't go to the authorities, leave.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So they were forced through years of experience to take the policy that you cannot trust the police.
Yeah.
But when I last discussed this with the founder of that charity, it was so bad that she was saying what we actually need is a network of people who are able to put up young people who are on the run from abuse for 2 weeks, and we move them around the country. Right. And I said, you're talking about an underground railroad. You're talking about the system that they used to get slaves out of the South using. She said, yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. That's what I wish I would have done. I don't.
Well, I mean, who, given how we're all brought up and what we're taught to believe, who would ever think it was necessary?
I know.
Exactly. We're taught to trust the police.
Exactly. Yeah, you are.
So you got the papers in.
So I got the papers. Oh, yeah. And I wish I'd have done some research at that point about the family court and joined some groups and stuff, but I didn't. I just got my solicitor and thought, right, well, this is going to cost an absolute fortune. All my house money will go, but let's just fight this. And so I remember my first intuition about the judge was that I just had a bad feeling. And he kind of looked at me like, he kind of glared at me, actually. This is straight away. And then it was literally then a very, very, where they drain your finances. So you're paying for your solicitor to basically do admin, to apply for evidence from the social services, police disclosure, more court hearings. It's all a load of, it's just all money making. It's all a way to drain money off parents. It's, you know, when you're in private law proceedings, it costs an absolute arm and a leg.
Do you have a figure how much you spent?
I've spent over 150,000. My house was like, the house was worth that, and there was no mortgage. That's what I spent. I probably spent over that, really. Yeah. And my mum's, you know, spent money helping me when I ran out as well. So yeah, it's cost an arm and a leg. So that kind of carried on. So at that point, we still hadn't had the drug results, but then at the beginning of 2016, so the court, I think we'd had 1 or 2 hearings at that point. Then we'd heard about the independent inquiry into child sex abuse. So we rang them and then gave them all the details, and then they put us in touch with a detective chief inspector from Greater Manchester Police who was working via Operation Hydrant. And so it was a different police officer of a higher rank. So after I spoke to him a few times, I had just actually viewed all the all the 8 police interviews, because of family court, we were able to view them at our solicitors' offices. And after seeing my eldest son's, like, tons of evidence about the descriptions of the injections, there was no doubt in my mind that it sounded like he'd been drugged. So, speaking to this new detective chief inspector, he just basically asked me a few questions to see whether it met with their requirements, and he said, yeah, it does meet with the requirements. So I'm going to authorize it to be tested. Those hair samples that have been sat there since January 2015 in sealed bags. So, because at first I didn't understand whether if there were any drugs, they'd still be in there. But then he was like, well, they'd be frozen in time. Whatever's in the hair, it's there then, you know. So a few weeks later.
So a year, basically a year had elapsed.
Yeah, nearly a year and a half at that point when they were tested.
Okay.
So they were tested at the summer of 2016, and then they came back with 3 types of drugs. There was nodiazepam it's called, which can either be a breakdown of benzodiazepines or a drug in its own right from the USA. The other drug was temazepam, which is a benzodiazepine, and the other one is called zolpidem, which is a different chemical structure, and that is the current date rape drug of choice, zolpidem, because it is apparently it's impossible to detect in blood and urine after 48 hours, and difficult to detect in hair if there's only been small doses. And it's important, you'll see why later. If there's only been small doses, it won't show up in the hair. But yeah, it was in my boy's hair.
Right. So any rational viewer at this point would be thinking, well, you've now got physical evidence.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I thought
case over.
Yeah, I did, and obviously they sent it to the CPS as well. But they said not enough evidence. It doesn't prove who's done it. I said, well, my eldest son said who did it, and there's the evidence to say, you know, no, it's still not enough. And they could have got it surface contamination, environmental exposure. And it's like, that's ridiculous.
What?
I know, yeah.
Environmental exposure to a date rape drug.
Date rape drugs, yeah, that none of us had ever been prescribed. You know, it just didn't make any sense, none at all. So I thought, well, at least the family court will use this to keep him away from my children. So obviously this carried on. The results were brought in. I could tell immediately that the father obviously wasn't going to say it was him, wasn't going to admit to it, because then he said, well, he got his solicitor to get all our hair checked for drugs. This was October 2016, and of course they all came back negative. Mine, the boys, his, my mother's, you know, it's just. So I knew what he was doing at that point. Oh, it's nothing to do with me. Let's just check everyone else and blah blah blah. So at that point, I had a barrister at that point, and he was saying they could take your children off you. He could get shared custody, and I said, well, we've got evidence. That's not going to happen. We've got evidence of these drugs. And I remember him looking at me like, and I went, you know, he obviously knew something, that was the pattern of what they do at family court. You know, oh, drop these allegations. Maybe if you drop the allegations, they won't take your children. And at that point, you just think, I'm not going to drop the allegations because they're true. You know, we've got this. How on earth can I allow this man to see my children?
And I would have to say, had you dropped the allegations, that would have been viewed as you admitting the allegations are false, and you would have probably been imprisoned.
Exactly.
It's very interesting that your QC would suggest such a thing, such a course of action to you.
Well, it wasn't a QC at that point. It was like a junior barrister, but yeah, it's. So I carried on, and then it ended in a very lengthy fact finding of I think it was going on for 10 days. This was February 2017. And so basically we had the witnesses were me, mum, my sister, my brother-in-law. They're all people that the boys disclosed to. And then there was the hair specialist, the forensic specialist, who didn't really seem to know much, and she was a bit like, don't know, just wasn't very professional. There was the doctor at the hospital, and then there was the two police, the ones I complained about. They came in to support the father. So not the other police.
The police supported the father?
Yes, he wanted them in as witnesses. The two police that asked, the DC and the DI who were complained about. So not the one who interviewed the boys, not her, not the DCI, but them two. They were brought in. And I've just done a video about them, actually, that I've released on YouTube called, you may have seen it, it's about how they committed perjury, how two GMP cops committed perjury in court. So I've got a YouTube video on that if anyone wants to see, because I kind of started to present all my evidence online. Not the actual statements themselves, but segments of them, and so people can see exactly what these two police officers did. And then there was my husband. Obviously, he's the other party, and then there was the couple, the gay couple. They attended, and then there was the father, the grandfather. He was there, and then a couple of other of the named abusers. They were in, and it was just like they were just like a freak show. That's how I described them as. So I thought, well, at least the judge will see all of this freak show of people, child abusers, and he could see how honest me and my family were. It was an intense, my mum was in the witness box for 3.5 days. So out of that 9.5 days or whatever, 3.5 was spent grilling my mum.
That's horrendous. I've done witness, not in cases like this, I've done witness work where it's been a technical matter. And I've been in the witness box for most of a day. And I found it extremely draining.
Oh, it's very draining.
And because there's huge amounts of adrenaline, and then when it stops, there's a big down. I mean, to do that for 3 days must have been enormously
horrific. She really held it together, bless her. They were brutal, the barristers who grilled her. Absolutely brutal. The judge didn't stop it. They're meant to intervene. He allowed the barrister to say, "Shut up." I think he said that to my brother-in-law, actually. And he just a load of abuse, basically. He allowed it. So at the end of it, my mum had a migraine, but she held it together. Because I had less than that. I think, did I have a day and a half or something? I ended up crying at the end of it. And it's not like me. I don't cry easily, but they're just monsters. They're absolutely hideous. And then the abusers just get a quick, "Did you do it? No. Okay, bye." That was it, just literally.
So what was your legal representation like?
I felt like because at that point I had a different barrister than the one who said about, "Oh, they could take your children," because I thought, well, if I get the right representation, they're not going to do that. I felt like she'd kind of passed her sell-by date. And when they're not bothered, basically. I saw her having a coffee with one of the opposing barristers. When I walked past Cafe Nero, I saw them having a coffee together in the morning. And I also, I overheard on one particular traumatic day, I overheard them say, "Oh, looking forward to getting back to EastEnders." And it was just like, we're going through hell and you're worried about getting back for EastEnders. Yeah. So I don't rate it really, but they're all part of the system at the end of the day. Yeah.
If you to do it again, would you represent yourself?
Yes. Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I this is a pattern I've seen where people have lost their kids, and in one case, it looks like the person's, the family's solicitor was colluding with the opposition. Don't quite have enough to say that definitively, but that's got the smell of that about it.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
What happened was he dropped the case with no warning. The government side had warning, but the person concerned was left without any legal representation on the day of the hearing, with no explanation. And then found that they couldn't get any other legal representation. It's a very tightly organised club in Scotland. It's even tighter than in England. So he had to represent himself. And what he found was that he was able to make much more progress, because despite the fact that this person had no legal training, wasn't in the professional world at all, and didn't, I mean, it was an entirely strange environment. It was still a huge advantage, because he was seeing the evidence. The disclosures were coming to him, not to his lawyer. And because he was seeing things directly and had more control, he was able to do better than the legal team had done, and establish things more, explore areas that the lawyer just wouldn't have gone near. So despite the fact that it's very much an unequal battle, it still seems that in a choice between a legal representation that doesn't care and representing yourself, the advantage seems to be in the latter, despite the fact that it's a very difficult thing to do. And in many ways, you should have someone else representing you, because all of the emotion that's involved in all of these cases means that the person involved is not actually best placed to make decisions. Not best placed to think strategically. It's almost an impossible task, but nevertheless, it seems that the representation is often so poor that it's still the better option.
Yeah. And you just wonder whether they just all it's all set out beforehand. Oh, we know what's going to happen here, and they're just not trying. It's almost like they've given up anyway.
Yes, yeah, a foregone conclusion. I know what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
the case went on 10 days, which is enormous.
Yeah,
I can see why you went through £150,000 and change.
Exactly. So the fact finding itself was probably cost about 30 grand for the legal representation. So yeah, at the end of that, then there was a few weeks before the judgment, because he couldn't get any court time. So there was a few weeks between that happening. And I thought, worst case scenario, they might give us shared custody. And I always thought, well, I can protect my children at the end of the day. I didn't know that they had such authority over the police force to help them, and criminally bound injunctions, because the family court and the use obviously balance of probability. So yeah. And
at this time, during the hearings, the boys are with you and they're not seeing the father. So that at this point they're still safe. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, they've not seen the father since December 2014, and it was now March 2017. So it was like nearly 2.5 years of not seeing him.
I mean, that alone, because normally the family courts will at least take the life of a child. The child is settled and happy and progressing. You would think, and it often is the case, that stands for quite a lot, that they don't necessarily change things radically.
Yeah, they changed things absolutely radically in this case. It was just absolutely hideous. The judge went out of his way to destroy us. I could see it wasn't going my way. It was looking hideous. I knew what was coming when he first started to read out the judgment, so I just ran out. I just basically disappeared. And then I went to this, my mum was already there in the lodge with my sons, and I just got there before I listened to the end of it. And I just told my mum to leave. And then basically I just I just thought they could, at that point, try to get the police out to get us. And then I was just basically, you know, we just had enough food. I basically just got a bit of food there that was probably enough for about 2 weeks at a push. And then I think it was the day after or that evening I started to see it on the news. First of all, I saw it on the internet, Nottinghamshire Police. I thought, oh my goodness, they're looking for us. So they started to report it like we were missing. And to get people concerned about this, you know, this mother and boys who'd gone missing. And then literally a few days later, they changed it. So a mother had abducted her own sons. So
you've not done anything. They've changed reality. The court's changed reality.
Yeah.
And then because you're doing what you'd done the day before, you're defined as having abducted your sons.
Yes, because I didn't stay to the end of the court. And allowed them just to take my sons off me, which would have happened. They would have just collected my son from school, and taken my eldest son from home, and that would have been it. So then they eventually found us. The police eventually found us, not through carelessness, like with mobile phones, cars, etc., because I didn't have any of that. Well, I had a car with me, but it wasn't mine. And it was basically because my mum signed in to the lodge with the boys' names and her name, because obviously she wouldn't know at that point that, you know, that this is going to happen. So that's how it was the owner of the lodges who then contacted the police after 10 days. And then it was literally 1 a.m. when I heard this horrific noise, like a drilling noise, this smashing noise. So I immediately leapt up and ran into my son's room. And then my eldest son was already sat up on his bed screaming. So I just went and sat, you know, we were hugging, and I was shouting my youngest son to come over as well. But he just stayed in bed, and then they just burst in. The police were just in a matter of seconds. Shouted, "Get off him," with my son still gripping onto me, and then basically took me away in my pyjamas. Just grabbed some wellies on the way out. There was walked over some glass and just took me off in the night. And I went off to took me to Mansfield Police Station in Nottinghamshire. Kept me in a cell, and basically the other one stayed with my sons, who carried on disclosing. They were saying, "Mummy hasn't done anything wrong. Our daddy did sexually abused us. Do you know what that is? Blah blah blah." But they were just completely ignored. They disclosed to the social worker. She shut them down basically, because she's this evil extension of the family court, and drove off with them. They said, "We want Mummy. You can't live with Mummy." "Well, what about Auntie Noni then?" And then they said, "That's the nickname for my sister." And then they ignored her and said, "You've got another auntie who loves you, and your daddy. What about them?" You know, it's just hideous. That immediately they wanted them to sever the ties between me and my family.
That's creepy, actually.
Really creepy.
That someone would try and manipulate under those circumstances and with that trauma, would immediately go to start to manipulate the emotions of a child like that.
Yeah, and that's what they did.
To reverse what the child's clearly saying.
Yeah.
There's something dark and disturbed about anyone who would do that. It's very worrying.
It's pure evil. Yeah.
I mean, this is, you've undergone here a no-knock raid, the sort of thing that a drugs barn might expect, but a mother and family should be protected from by those same police in this country.
Yeah, and do you know what else the social worker did, who was basically a voice piece for the family court? She told them, "This mother is an emotional harm and a physical harm."
Physical? How?
Yes, because they made these findings. They said emotional harm for the believing they've been sexually abused and they haven't, false belief system, and physical harm because they made findings that it was me and or my mother who drugged the boys in December 2014 to corroborate evidence against the father after becoming dissatisfied with the police investigation. So that was their physical harm. So they didn't even explain to the police.
This is a bizarre conspiracy theory.
Yes.
So their official line is that you drugged your own children in 2014.
Yeah, which is scientifically impossible, by the way, to December 2014.
Yeah, right. Which is scientifically impossible because the hair grows at a set rate. Yes.
Yeah, we've got hair.
And you somehow knew. You then let that evidence sit and not be tested for nearly 18 months.
Exactly.
And it was only when another officer got involved through ICSA that you got the thing tested.
Yes. Yeah,
that was your alleged plot.
Yeah, that's the judge's evidence.
It's bizarre. It's perverse, is what it is.
Yes,
it's perverse.
So I was released without charge because I couldn't be done for abduction because I hadn't seen the whole judgment at that point. They were still in my care. They were still in my custody when I went to the lodge, as far as I knew. Mm-hmm. So the police released me without charge. I went back to my sisters, me and mum and sister.
So hold a minute. If you were released without charge and you'd not done anything wrong, what was the justification for the 1 a.m. no-knock raid?
I think it was based on what the social worker had said. This woman is a physical harm.
Because...
I know.
But you know, what was the next morning not good enough? It's a bizarre... Exactly. As a policing decision... This is also perverse. It doesn't seem to have any anchor in reality.
No. And this judge ordered Nottinghamshire Police to stop all their murder investigations as well, whilst looking for me and the boys. And there were 100 police officers on the case.
What?
I know.
Dear me.
I think it's unprecedented.
So the whole of Nottinghamshire Police was basically after you.
Yeah, and they'd alerted other police forces. They'd even been up to alert people in Scotland, just in case we were on our way up there. This literally...
Now, you see, the logical conclusion from that is that you've posed some sort of immediate threat to your own children.
Yes.
Right? For which there was zero evidence.
Yes.
It's a bizarre conclusion, perverse conclusion to come to. If it was a case of you weren't obeying the family court, okay, civil action, civil decision, then surely the process to force your compliance would have been a much longer one through hearings and through even if they were tracking, it's impossible to run. One of the problems is in our society today, it's almost, this is why the founder of the Dundee charity was talking about an underground railroad. It's almost impossible to run because you can't get a job, you can't support yourself, you can't use any form of electronic payment. It becomes you're relying on charity, and it's so expensive to live that becomes close on impossible. You can't. There's no benefits available. There's no support from the state. There's no support from anywhere. So you end up, particularly if you've got kids, you can't live in the street, you can't sleep in a doorway.
No.
What can anybody do in these circumstances? Running is...
That's why I always say, I basically, my mission is to try and educate people about the signs to look out for that your child is being abused, because then if you put up a hidden camera Because if your children are only ever with close family members and they're showing all these signs that they shouldn't be doing, they're being abused by someone close, probably, you know, more than likely if they've got all these symptoms. So chances are is that you can do surveillance without breaking into anyone's house, and you can put hidden cameras up, recording devices even, get your own evidence beforehand. No one thinks in a million years that this is going to happen to them. That's a problem. If you've had a good childhood like I did, and you've not been abused, and you've not come across any abuse, you just naively, you just don't think that you're going to run into a blooming Satanist paedophile and get married to one, do you? No one thinks that in a million years. But yeah, that's what I try and warn people to do that. And if they do disclose and you haven't done all of that, then I would say don't go to the police straight away. Maybe do your own, maybe get a private investigator or somebody to do some investigative work on this person, just to because the police don't do the job. Not saying all police, but you know, in our case, it couldn't have been worse, to be honest. But just to kind of protect yourselves, do it differently, and then have another strategy in place. I think you have to have either quite a lot of cash yourself, or have that access to it from family or friends who can help, and then you get somewhere safe, get into another country, a non-extradition country like Northern Cyprus. I know a lot of people have fled there. I don't personally know them, I'm just saying I know of a lot of people who've done that, and that would seem, but even that carries some kind of risk, because you know the abusers could come after you and, you know, try and abduct the children that way. But yeah, basically it couldn't have been any worse than what's happened to me now. So that's what I would say to people.
Yeah, this is good advice. We'll come back to this, I think, when we get to the end of the series, as to what the correct procedure is for dealing with these things, because simply trusting the authorities is quite clearly not acceptable, not working in too many cases. Yeah. Samantha, thank you very much for sharing your story with me today. We'll pick this up next week, and we'll start from this horrendous raid with your children taken, and what then transpired. You mentioned you've been arrested 3 times. We're clearly a long way from the end of the story. In fact, you're living the story now, so it's not at its end yet. Yes. Thank you very much for your courage in speaking to us today. It's been a real privilege listening to you. And until next week, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.